Traveling across the Old West in a covered wagon wasn't just an adventure, but a battle for survival. The journey was long, dangerous, and let's be honest, pretty miserable. But it was the only way for thousands of pioneers to chase their dreams of land and opportunity. Before romanticizing life on the trail, look at the top 10 brutal facts about traveling the Old West in a covered wagon. After months of trudging through endless prairies, crossing dangerous rivers, and surviving disease, exhaustion, and accidents, settlers who finally arrived in the West should have breathed a sigh of relief. But the truth was, the hardest part of their journey was beginning. Reaching the frontier did not mean they had made it. It simply meant they had to fight to survive in an unforgiving land. The journey west was brutal, and not everyone survived it. By the time settlers reached their destination, many had lost family members. A husband might arrive as a widower, a child without parents, or a wife without her husband. Graves lined the trails west, silent reminders of the trip's danger. The emotional toll was just as devastating as the physical one. Even those who arrived with their families intact often faced another problem. They were broke. After months on the trail, many settlers had spent all their money on supplies, medical treatments, and emergency repairs to their wagons. When they finally reached their land, they had little to nothing left. Some turned to bartering, trading whatever goods they had for food, tools, or livestock. Others had to take whatever work they could find to survive. Sickness remained a constant threat. The lack of proper sanitation and medical care made even small illnesses life-threatening. Simple infections could turn deadly. Harsh winters and limited food supplies meant many settlers, especially children and the elderly, did not make it through their first year. The West was a place of opportunity, but only for those who could endure its challenges. Imagine traveling for 10 hours straight under the scorching sun, covered in dust, your feet aching from walking all day. As the sun sets, you finally stop for the night, hoping for a peaceful rest. But finding a campsite was no easy task. With thousands of wagons moving west, every good resting spot was already packed. The camps were loud, filthy, and sometimes downright dangerous. If lucky, you found a spot away from the worst noise and chaos. If not, you just had to make do and hope for the best. During the busiest seasons, thousands of people traveled together. Every evening, families rushed to find a spot to camp, but the best spots were taken quickly. Many people camped together in large groups for safety. This meant they formed wagon circles, but it also meant being squished in with other travelers. The camps smelled awful because people couldn't bathe or clean up. After weeks or months on the trail, basic hygiene was nearly impossible. If you needed to go to the bathroom, you had no choice but to use nature. There were no toilets or privacy. People had to walk far from camp to find a place to go, sometimes digging small holes. The campsites got very dirty, and many people used the same areas. Flies were everywhere, and diseases spread quickly. One deadly disease, dysentery, caused people to get very sick from contaminated water and food. Many died because they couldn't find clean water or stay healthy. Even when the day was over, the night brought new problems. Mosquitoes were a huge problem, especially near water. People had to deal with itchy bites without bug spray, and some mosquitoes carried dangerous diseases. Other bugs like fleas and lice also made the nights uncomfortable, and people had trouble sleeping. Another pressing issue was that wolves, coyotes, and even bears roamed the area, attracted by the smell of food. While they usually avoided people, Hungry animals sometimes attacked livestock or small children. Travelers had to monitor their animals and store their food carefully and closely. After dealing with everything else, people still had to wake up early the next day to start walking again. There wasn't much time to rest. If someone slept in, they might be left behind by the group. They packed up their wagons every morning, gathered their animals, and set off again. It was a never-ending cycle of tiredness and survival. The covered wagons were built to carry everything a family needed for the west-long journey. But even though they were sturdy, the wagons weren't designed for the rough conditions of the trail. The roads were often bumpy, muddy, or rocky, which made the wagons shake and strain. This constant pressure caused important parts of the wagon, like the wheels, axles, and tongues, to break easily. The wheels, made of wood and metal, could snap under stress. Axles, which connected the wheels to the wagon, were also prone to breaking because of the rough roads and heavy load. The tongue, the piece of wood that connected the wagon to the oxen or horses, could crack or break from the strain. A wagon could break down at any moment, leaving travelers stuck in the middle of nowhere. When a wagon broke down, no repair shops were nearby to fix it. Settlers had to be creative and fix it with whatever materials they had. If a wheel broke, they might have a spare one or try to repair it with rope or wood. But some problems, like a broken axle, were harder to fix. Sometimes settlers had to wait for someone else to have the right parts to help them. This could mean long delays, sometimes for weeks, while they figured out how to repair the wagon. Without the right tools or materials, some travelers couldn't fix their wagons at all. In the worst cases, they might have to leave behind their belongings or abandon the wagon altogether. The risk of being stranded by a broken wagon was a constant worry.
Because wagons broke down so often, spare parts were very valuable. If a settler had a spare wheel, axle, or tongue, it was like having a treasure. Many travelers tried to carry extra parts, but space was limited, so they had to be careful about what they brought. If a wagon broke and the settlers didn't have a spare part, they could try to trade with others. But that wasn't always easy. As they traveled farther west, it became harder to find parts or supplies, and the price for them went up. Some travelers had to trade important supplies like food or medicine for spare parts. In other cases, settlers went without the necessary parts, which meant they had to risk continuing the journey without a functioning wagon. Hollywood often shows Native Americans as constantly attacking settlers, but this wasn't the case. Most Native American tribes were focused on their survival and culture, not on fighting settlers. While there were some clashes, especially when settlers took over native lands, violent attacks were rare. Many tribes, like the Nez Perce and Shoshone, helped settlers by sharing their knowledge of the land. They taught settlers how to find food, water, and shelter in the wilderness. Without this help, many settlers wouldn't have made it through the journey. Native Americans were not enemies, but helpful guys in many cases. They didn't have all the tools or knowledge they needed to survive. That's where Native Americans came in. Settlers often traded goods like blankets and tools with native tribes in exchange for help with survival. Native Americans taught settlers how to hunt, gather plants, and make fire. They also showed them how to navigate rivers and mountains safely. Besides survival skills, Native Americans also provided settlers with important resources like food, furs, and medicines. This trading system helped both groups survive in a tough environment. Native tribes were not just giving, but also receiving things they needed, making it a mutually beneficial relationship. People who traveled in covered wagons to the Old West faced many dangers. Some of these dangers, like rough terrain and wild animals, were easy to see. But one of the biggest challenges was the weather. The weather in the Old West was extreme and unforgiving. In the summer, the heat in the Old West could be unbearable. Temperatures often went above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The sun would beat down on the settlers all day. The covered wagons were meant to protect them from rain, and the sun would trap the heat inside. It was like being stuck in an oven. This heat wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. Heat stroke was a real risk, and many settlers suffered from dehydration because they didn't have enough water to drink. It was easy to get tired and weak in such extreme heat, and some people didn't survive the hot summer months. But the weather wasn't just a problem in the summer. When winter came, the Old West turned into a frozen wasteland. The temperatures could drop well below freezing, especially in the mountains. Snowstorms would make the roads hard to follow, and getting lost in the snow was easy. The cold was so extreme that people would risk getting frostbite or even freezing to death. The covered wagons didn't offer much protection against the cold. Staying warm during the winter was a constant struggle without enough clothing or supplies. Every day was a fight to survive in the freezing temperatures. Thunderstorms were another big problem in the Old West. During the summer, rainstorms would hit suddenly. And when they did, they made the roads turn into sticky, wet mud. The dirt paths that settlers traveled on would become so muddy that the wagons would get stuck. The settlers sometimes had to spend hours or even days digging the wagons out of the mud. One of the most common and gruesome accidents involved wagon wheels. These massive wooden wheels were incredibly heavy and could easily crush a person who got in their way. Imagine walking for hours, exhausted and distracted, when suddenly you trip and fall near a moving wagon. A wheel could roll over you if you were unlucky enough to land in the wrong spot. Broken bones were common, and in many cases the injuries were fatal. Children were especially vulnerable. Many would play near the wagons, unaware of the danger. A single misstep could cost them their lives. Since medical care on the trail was almost non-existent, even a crushed foot or leg could lead to deadly infections. There were no hospitals, doctors, or ways to treat serious wounds properly. For many, a simple accident meant the end of the journey. One of the most terrifying dangers of the journey west was crossing rivers. Unlike today, where bridges make river crossings easy, pioneers had to find a way to get their wagons, animals, and families across rushing water. This was not a simple task. Many rivers were deep, fast-moving, and unpredictable. If a wagon was too heavy or the current too strong, it could be swept away instantly. Entire families drowned when their wagons tipped over. Oxen, the backbone of the journey, often panicked in the water and dragged wagons down with them. Supplies would be lost, leaving survivors stranded without food, clothing, or vital tools. Water damage could ruin everything inside, even if a wagon made it across. Soaked flour and sugar became useless. Gunpowder turned to mush, and clothing and blankets would be impossible to dry in time for the cold nights ahead. A failed river crossing did not just mean danger at the moment. It could mean starvation and misery for weeks to come. Among all the diseases that plagued pioneers, cholera was the deadliest. This ruthless infection could kill a person in just a few hours. It started with stomach cramps and severe diarrhea, but the real danger was dehydration. People on the trail often did not realize their water sources were contaminated, and once cholera struck, it spread rapidly. Entire families could be wiped out within days. The worst part was that nobody understood how to stop it. Doctors were rare, and the few medical remedies available were often useless. Some pioneers tried drinking vinegar or eating burnt toast as a cure. Others believed in bleeding patients to balance the humors, which only made things worse. Once someone had cholera, there was little to do except hope their body was strong enough to fight it off. Cholera was not the only deadly disease pioneers faced. Smallpox, dysentery, and typhoid were also major threats. Smallpox was especially terrifying. It caused high fevers, painful sores, and often left survivors scarred for life. Unlike cholera, which killed quickly, smallpox dragged on for weeks. If an outbreak hit a wagon train, it could decimate entire groups. The only real protection was a crude form of vaccination, but not everyone could access it. Dysentery was another common killer, causing severe diarrhea and dehydration. It came from drinking dirty water or eating contaminated food. People who got dysentery often wasted away, too weak to walk or even sit up. The problem was that the symptoms were so similar to cholera that many people did not even know which disease they had. The treatment was the same: hope and luck. Typhoid fever was another deadly illness caused by bad water and poor sanitation. It caused high fevers, stomach pain, and extreme exhaustion. If it did not kill a person outright, it left them too weak to continue the journey. Many families had no choice but to bury their loved ones by the side of the trail and press on. 3 of the most common foods on the trail were salt pork, dried beans, and hardtack. Salt pork was just fatty meat packed with salt so it would not rot. Before eating it, pioneers had to soak or boil it to remove some salt. It was greasy, chewy, and not very tasty even after that. Eating too much of it could make people sick. Dried beans were great because they lasted long but took hours to cook. Since firewood was often hard to find, many people ate half-cooked beans, which caused stomach problems. Hardtack was a simple cracker made from flour and water, baked until rock hard. It could last years, but biting into it was like chewing on a brick. Pioneers had to soak it in water or coffee to soften it. If it were stored too long, tiny bugs would get inside. People often had to shake or break the biscuits open to get the worms out before eating. Outlaws or criminals often target wagon trains because they know the travelers are vulnerable. Many of these bandits were experienced criminals who had robbed banks or stagecoaches. Others were just desperate people trying to survive. These criminals would often attack at night, sneaking up on the wagon trains while people slept. They might steal food, livestock, or even entire wagons. One of the most famous groups of criminals, called the Plumber Gang, was known for robbing travelers and leaving them stranded in the wilderness.
Other times, bandits would wait for smaller groups of travelers or lone settlers. Armed with guns, they would demand money, food, or livestock. If the travelers didn't give them what they wanted, the bandits could kill them. And because there were no police or soldiers nearby, there was little chance of getting help. Most wagon trains took 4 to 6 months to reach their destination. That is half a year of waking up at sunrise, packing camp, trudging along dusty trails, and then setting up camp again. There were no shortcuts, no rest stops, and no way to turn back once you got too far in. Even under the best conditions, the journey stretched on for what felt like forever. A simple rainstorm could turn dirt roads into thick mud, slowing progress to a miserable crawl. Steep mountain passes forced travelers to move even slower, sometimes unloading wagons and carrying belongings by hand. And let's not forget about river crossings, which could take hours or even days if the water was too deep or fast-moving. A good day on the trail meant covering about 15 miles. That is it. In perspective, a modern car traveling on a highway could cover the Oregon Trail in less than a day. Even a person walking steadily can cover 15 miles in about 5 hours. But covered wagons were not built for speed. They were heavy, bulky, and pulled by oxen or mules, which meant slow and steady was the only way forward. Some days were even worse. Rough terrain, broken wagon wheels, and bad weather often meant covering only a few miles before stopping for the night. In the worst cases, travelers were forced to stay put for days, waiting for conditions to improve. For anyone impatient, the slow crawl west must have been pure torture. Would you have survived journeying the harsh terrains of the Wild West in a slow wagon? Please share your thoughts with us. Thanks for watching.